8,000 square kilometers was the total area then. And by 2007, this picture's from 2008, but in 2007 it was 10% of the original size that it was. All of the basins, they basically have now formed 2 lake basins that many people who were born recently they refer to these as separate places, not necessarily even knowing that the Aral Sea once was a continuous lake. And it's devastated the agricultural industries around there, it's devastated the ability of people to live on the lake, and it's destroyed the fishing industry. Because basically it was, there was too much water drained for it, for irrigation, there was too much pollutants allowed to run into it in terms of fertilizer, and a lot of the freshwater sources that flow into it were altered with dams or other hydrologic modifications. So I bring this up as an example because it's probably one of the most famous, as well as dramatic changes to go from the 4th largest lake to one that looks like this in such a water-poor region is an environmental disaster, very much human-mediated, and we'll talk about that. The other example I have, partially because of, I think, what I'll call the hubris of this, is the example of the Tigris and Euphrates. So this is a satellite image showing those Mesopotamian marshes that are between the Euphrates and the Tigris in Iraq in the 1970s, and again in the year 2000. What's missing? Water. So why I chose this example is that what happened in between those time periods in Iraq? Who was in power?
What were the years?
Between about 1980 and 2000.
Saddam
Hussein. So he, under his leadership, had a pocket of rebellious tribes that were aligning with Western allies that are the marsh Arabs that I talked about in the first slide. So he decided the best way to control a rebellious population was to drain all of these marshes. So I partially bring it up as an example of something we don't traditionally think is an environmental concern, but conflict. So war, because of that war, these marshes, which are the birthplace of civilization in many people's minds, were drained. There was canals dug through, plants removed, all sorts of things. They basically diverted all the water from here starting in about 1991 and blocked the flow of both the Tigris and Euphrates River. So it is, there is a reflooding project that I'll talk about in a couple minutes that's going on, but this is the sort of my example of water challenges in the world. They come from both naturally occurring, anthropogenic mediated, and conflict mediated projects. What are some of the impacts when places like the Aral Sea or the Mesopotamian marshes are drained? You have large ecological consequences as well as human consequences. You lose migration areas for birds, which cause declines in bird populations. Several endemic animal and plant species have gone extinct. You have much higher soil salinity in general because you have no fresh water coming in, which leads to loss of all sorts of human services like dairy production, fishing, rice cultivation. They estimate that about 7,500 square miles have become desert around this particular marsh area, and the drinking water supply is no longer present because salt water has flowed into the aquifers with pollutants. So there's a large string of consequences that come from that sort of transition. And not to mention the destruction of an entire cultural tradition that existed with the marsh Arab community. So, these are people who, they call them Madan, which I think I'm saying correctly. There was estimated there was populations of about 2,000 that were living in between in these very traditional homes. There was a much larger population, but 2,000 that were still living traditionally. And I think they estimated that 120,000 was the population level, and they estimated that because they had 120,000 refugees that left after the marshes were flooded, that could identify themselves as having lived there before. So the other part is I'll talk a lot about ecological consequences, but in keeping sustainability as our general topic in mind, not only is there environmental sustainability threatened, but cultural sustainability is a big impacted area as well when you have these sort of changes. Okay, so that was the plug both, why water is so important in terms of civilizations, both rising and falling, and then where humans play into that. We can have huge alterations to how civilizations, move, change, and are influenced by water. Now I'm going to talk about water resources, mainly looking at freshwater resources. I'll start globally, go down to the US. I'll spend a lot of time on California in this lecture, because after all, we are here, and we are in a place where water is an issue. I'm from Maryland originally, we don't think a lot about water in Maryland necessarily because it's everywhere. But here in California, it's a huge issue, and we have examples all around us of strange ways to deal with water, or maybe I should say artificial ways to deal with water, as well as shortages and things like that. So, the other reason that we spend so much time on water is this sort of prediction. The main prediction is that the next world war will be fought over water. That is the most limiting resource that exists on the planet in many people's minds. This has been said by, this happens to be someone who's an engineer. It's been said by the head of the UN. It was just said by one of the major generals in the US Army that his biggest concern, or the biggest threat to US security these days, is access to water as a resource. And that climate change thus factors into that. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Which means we should talk a little bit about what exists in terms of fresh water. So despite the apparent abundance of clean water in the US and most of the developed worlds, more than 20% of the Earth's population lacks clean, safe drinking water. Meaning that 2/5 of the world already face serious shortages. This could be from lack of water itself or from lack of clean drinking water. Waterborne diseases kills a child every 8 seconds, and all of this is predicted to get worse if we look at how climate change, in terms of lowered precipitation amounts for the most part, affects that number. So in 1955, we'll talk about what water scarce means, but 3 countries were listed as being water scarce. In 1990, that number had more than doubled, and it's predicted that within the next 20 years, you'll add another 7 countries, which includes 3 Nile nations, and that's what I was talking about before, that these places that used to be the water rich, the reason they were great, are now becoming on the list of water scarce. Okay, so the other challenge, and you guys know this already, but people don't think about it, there's so much water on the planet. However, 97% of that water is salt water, meaning that only 3% of the resources we have are actually fresh water. So this green bar is your salt water, this is also green, this mint-colored bar, 3% is your freshwater supply. So of the 3%, if we break that up, what percentage of that is accessible? Well, most of it is in ice caps. So you have almost 70% of that is bound up in ice caps and glaciers, which is another challenge. We are concerned that ice caps could be melting under global warming. And that water that's bound up in ice caps would now be released to what? Where would it go? To what?
Salt water.
Right, it would be put into the oceans. So again, you're losing part of the 70% of the fresh water that you have is now going to become inaccessible as well. 30% of this is in groundwater. What's the challenge of having 30% of that in groundwater? Seems good, right? Yeah.
You can't access it.
Right.
Where do you find it?
Exactly. So accessing the 30% that is in groundwater is a challenge because we don't know where it is necessarily. We can make guesses. The other thing is if you're looking at developing countries or places that need access to water, not all of them have the infrastructure to be able to access groundwater. So it is a much less accessible source than, say, the 1% that's more easily accessed in swamps, lakes, rivers, etc. So the breakdown of water is quite challenging. If we look at that surface water that is accessible, we have 87% is in lakes, 11% is in swamps, and 2% is in rivers. So the point is that very little water is actually available for drinking. Of that water that's available for drinking, it's not evenly distributed across the planet, and we know that. So this is a map that was put out by a website called waterlink.net, and their definition is, they have a couple levels of water scarcity that they define pretty exactly. So